We have a long and interesting day ahead of us, and I am delighted to be here. My name is Deborah Amos. I work for National Public Radio, and I have been covering the refugee issue and immigration for quite some time. So I am pleased to be the moderator of an incredibly distinguished panel. On my right is Madeleine Albright. She will kick us off today and hopefully close our session. But we have some other remarkable people to hear from in our first panel. Asmaa Albukaie. She's a case manager for New Americans, and in 2014, she became the first Syrian refugee in Idaho. Joanna Kakissis, I always have trouble with that, Kakissis, who is my friend, even though I have trouble pronouncing her name. She is an NPR correspondent. She's based in Athens. She's done some remarkable work on the refugee crisis in Greece. Helena de Bres, she's an associate professor of philosophy. Haki Abazi, he's with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and Richard Parker, that's an easy one, senior lecturer at the Shorenstein Center. I'm keeping the bio short because you all have them, and it gives you much more time to hear what people are going to talk about this morning. So we're going to kick off with Asma. Everyone in the panel will give a 3-minute talk. We will then open the discussion here on stage, and then we will open it to questions. So please think about what you want to ask. Thank you. Asma?
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Asma, as you know, and I am the first Syrian refugee to Boise, Idaho. In Syria, of course, I lived a typical life as any Syrian woman. I was cooking and having 2 children, but only my knowledge about United States from the movies. That's why I got my English. I learned my English only from the movies, American movies. I never attended any English school in Syria. And then in 2011, I had to leave my country because my husband killed in Syria, and I have to leave. I have 2 kids, and I have, as any mother, I need to let my kids in safe. So I choose Egypt to be a safety place, and it wasn't at all a safe place to me. Then I got resettled to be in the United States. For sure, I was very happy because now I can see the real life, not only the movies. So I came 2014 as a first Syrian refugee. For sure, I didn't know where I will be in the United States. They told me in Boise, Idaho. A lot of American friends in Egypt told me there is nothing in Boise, Idaho except potato and snow. But actually, there is a lot of beautiful things. There is good people, nice people, and also a lot of friends, sisters, and brothers, and they have American mom and dad now, which is I'm really proud of. And I work now with a refugee at Agency for New Americans to help also other refugees, not only from Syria, but also from any country need to be a refugee in the United States. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I think it's important to hear from an actual refugee, so thank you.
Yeah.
Madeleine?
Thank you. And let me just say, I first met Asma in the fall when at the White House they had a conference of refugees before we got ready for President Obama to go to the General Assembly. And same kind of reaction, Boise, Idaho. And you have shown how really welcoming Americans are. And I loved hearing your story then, and I'm very glad to see you again. I truly am delighted to be a part of this and to make the following point, that the refugee issue is clearly not new and has bedeviled the international system for quite some time. And when I was ambassador at the UN, it was very clear how complicated it was in terms of how the refugee camps operated and how the High Commissioner for Refugees at that stage, Madame Ogata, when she would come to talk at the Security Council, and people couldn't figure out how the refugee camps and the peacekeeping operations worked together, and what was the infrastructure in the refugee camps. Did the same animosities, for instance, that had motivated the Hutus and the Tutsis and the Interahamwe get restructured in the camps. And so I'm willing to say as I have followed this issue, that the international system has not worked for refugees, even though there are people that are of goodwill and are trying to sort it out. But as I mentioned in my remarks, the funding of the refugee operations, the then setting up of the camps, the then what happens in the long duration of the camps, and how the peacekeepers and the governments all operate together. So this is a large problem that keeps getting larger, and the international organizations are not up to dealing with it.
Thank you. Joanna?
Hello, everyone. It's true, the refugee crisis, dealing with refugees is nothing new for many countries, including in countries in Europe. Greece, though, has not had a lot of experience accepting refugees and taking care of them, as is the case right now, where 60,000 people are in the country trying to figure out what they're going to do next. I met the first Syrian refugees in January 2014 at a hotel in an area called Katopatissia. It's kind of a rundown area of Athens, but there's a street called Acharnon where there are a lot of smugglers. And people would go there, just a few hundred at the time in Greece, and buy fake passports to leave. After there was a crackdown on security at airports, when people would get caught with the fake passports, this route called the Balkan route opened up. And it was essentially walking through Greece and the Balkans and Hungary to reach Western Europe. People would use their GPS on their phones. They would just cut out smugglers entirely. They'd share maps on WhatsApp, and they would get to Europe. As this route became more and more popular, we saw what we saw in the summer and early fall of 2015, where thousands and thousands of people were using the route, and countries were just waving them through, knowing that they weren't going to stay in Greece or the Balkans and that they were headed either to Germany or Sweden. When Germany decided, more internally rather than externally than publicly, that the numbers were getting too high, that's when all the borders closed. And we saw what we saw in March of 2016 with lots of people getting stuck. Hungary was the first to close it in the fall of 2015, but in March of 2016, everybody was pretty much stuck in Greece. And there was this new agreement put in place between the European Union and Turkey to not allow new refugees to leave Greece, essentially. Unless they were cleared for resettlement. It's a process that takes a really long time, by the way, since 60,000 people are still in Greece. And what we've started to ask ourselves in Europe is, how can we accept refugees? Who is a refugee? What are the criteria? How do we get people out of Greece faster? But we're fighting some of the same forces. This is what I've noticed as a reporter, that we see, some of the populistic forces that we see here. People are afraid, and they're afraid because they don't know what a refugee is. And it's what we try to do as journalists, is to show that it's just they're people. They're people who live lives just like us. And that's actually a lot harder than it should be sometimes, putting that story to audio or to story, to getting it out there so people can understand what this phenomenon means on a one-on-one basis, rather than just big words, big streams of people on TV, and just drawing conclusions from that.
Thank you. Helena?
Hi. As a philosopher and an immigrant myself and a human, I come to this discussion with one central conviction. Because refugees are among the most vulnerable people in the world, we who are not refugees and who are highly advantaged besides, have an urgent moral duty to assist them. I don't think that any decent person can, with a good conscience, deny that claim. But decent people can disagree over what commitment to that claim entails. So I'm just going to mention a couple of disagreements that I think are especially important here. So the first question is the one actually that Joanna just mentioned: who counts as a refugee? So according to the definition used in international law, only those fleeing persecution count. So narrowly interpreted, that definition requires a refugee to prove that he or she has been singled out for attack on a narrow set of grounds. Many of those fleeing Syria at the moment can't do that because what they're fleeing is war, not sort of individual persecution in that way. So last year, Germany reduced the protections that it gives to many Syrians from full asylum to subsidiary protection for that reason, as they only get a 1-year permit and it takes them 2 years to try and bring their family in. Morally, I think that many of us operate with a definition that's broader than the narrow legal one, which is why Germany did, in fact, at the beginning, actually admit many people under full asylum. But once we recognize this, it can be hard to know where to stop. I think some of the resistance comes from here. If fleeing from war makes you a refugee, shouldn't fleeing from natural disasters or serious desperate poverty also count? In all those situations, persecution, war, natural disasters, the problem is that people's basic rights to shelter, nutrition, protection, bodily security are at risk. So surely that's what's morally crucial. Why should we prioritize particular reasons for fleeing from harm rather than simply focusing on the severity of the need? So by analogy, normally when someone comes to the emergency room, doctors don't ask before giving treatment, did you break this leg because you were fleeing from a hate crime, or was it that you were fleeing from a tsunami, or did you break it because your landlord was running after you because you hadn't paid rent for 6 months? Instead, they think, yeah, we should just treat the leg. So there's a question there about what we ought to do. There's compelling arguments on both sides. I'm just raising the question here. Second question is, assuming that we do have strong moral duties to assist refugees, how should that burden be distributed across different countries? There are practical reasons, of course, why refugees go to particular countries initially, but they can be transferred to other countries afterwards. As a matter of fact, though, they often end up staying in the places they initially sought asylum, and 87% of refugees are hosted in developing countries who have their own very serious problems to deal with. There's two important moral questions there. What is an initial fair distribution of responsibility of the burden to assist these people? And then if some people don't actually do their responsibility, what's the responsibility of those left, the more responsible countries? If the United States, for instance, acts disgracefully as it is at the moment, what's the obligation of other countries to take up the slack? Again, there's compelling arguments on both sides about how to deal with that situation, whether the failure of others to do their obligation results in further obligations for the rest. I'm just raising the question. I think it's important that we consider arguments carefully on both sides of those and other questions, while at the same time not losing sight of the fact that I started with, that these people we're trying to help are among the most vulnerable people in the world, and that grounds an urgent duty of both humanitarianism and justice to help them out.
Thank you. Haki.
Thank you. So I guess there is a pattern here. I was a refugee in '99. I'm a Kosovar Albanian and lived in Macedonia until this country intervened to actually restore the space to go back to my home. Like all refugees, I believe, all over the world would like to go back to the normal. But actually today, what I'm going to share with you is a very profound change that happened last night in this town, or in this city. We went with my colleagues to watch a movie, I'm Not Your Negro. And I think that why that changes, among many great things that the movie shows to us, are the root causes of where humanity has ended up by ignoring exactly the issues of our neighbors, our people we live and tend to believe we respect them, but actually we ignore the issues of those people. And there was a sentence saying, history is not our past, history is what we carry with ourselves. And I think the refugees today around the world are a consequence of the history of a failed governance methods allowing dictators to operate all over the world with a big freedom because of multiple reasons and factors and interests that have been shaped historically in the world as part of the geopolitics. And the reason why we see the biggest number of refugees now and potentially in next 10 years, 150 more million refugees moving from their houses and places, It is because the governance is failing, because the global governance is not there to support real democratic forces, participation of citizens in decision-making, and allowing for deals to be made up there and really never pay attention to what the reality on the ground is. So those people the refugees don't need mercy. They cannot be treated as different. They are human beings. And I think, at the risk of being even controversial here, I think the biggest question is, how do we keep agency with those people? How do we make sure that those people are not stripped from their dignity the way we're seeing happening to them and being treated in different countries, including in their countries, while United Nations continues endless negotiations in luxurious places in Geneva and Paris and elsewhere. So the level of hypocrisy has to be removed from dealing with the refugees and moving people and go back to the real fundamental issues of humanity, which is representation, it is governance, and it is global governance as well. So the guilt is all of us. We think that the history does not contribute to what we have created today, but I think that's where we have to go back and look. The issues of equality, justice, treating people and allowing them to live their own resources without being captured by the crony capitalism around the world, it's going to be key to restoring freedom and proper life for those people. We cannot improvise systems and try to think that we're going to solve the problems of the people by having deals here and there, which we know they're not sustaining, even in a post-conflict situation. The history that I'm talking is the Palestinians. For 60 years, they are the biggest number of the people living as refugees around the world, and the decision makers, important people, have turned blind eye, allowing for that to happen, which means making normal for Syrians and Iraqis and others to be treated exactly the same as Palestinians and still be okay. We need to know why this is happening and actually address those deep, deep root causes of the problem. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Richard?
I'm neither a moralist nor a deep thinker. I'm an economist. But I want to begin by emphasizing that we need to be extraordinarily sober in this discussion. And we need to be, for one very important reason that Wellesley needs to keep in mind, that the first woman nominated for the presidency of the United States lost, and she lost because her opponent, Donald Trump, in part, carried the majority of white women voters. So to speak of categories of people by identity belies the fact that the complexities of the world we are in today require complex calculations about how to move forward. That is, I think Haki and Helene have both named wonderfully the large principles that need to be taken into consideration, but we also need to think very, very coldly and clearly about the tactics needed to achieve the political power in a host country like ours and in a world-shaping country like ours that can move us toward embrace of those ideas. And that in turn requires an understanding of why it is that Trump was elected president and how he was able to play on fear. We are a country of immigrants. Everyone here is an immigrant from someplace else or the descendant of an immigrant from someplace else. And that applies to Native Americans who were, 25,000 years ago, Native Asians before they crossed the Bering Land Bridge to become Native Americans. We now are in the midst of the third great migration to the United States, and we have a larger percentage of Americans today than at any point in our history who were foreign-born or are the sons or daughters of foreign-born. There has been a real and substantial dislocation of what once was the American industrial heartland that in the minds of many of those who have lost in that part of the world is in part a responsibility of, as a consequence of our immigration policy. And so there's a question of economics and immigration that is linked to, in the minds of many, the question of humanitarianism and refugees. And we need to have a political understanding that goes deeply into recognizing that to win that support among those constituencies, not all, not even a majority, but a significant minority, requires having a theory of both the treatment of refugees and a treatment of our fellow citizens. And our fellow citizens, particularly in the Rust Belts in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan, those crucial firewall states that Mrs. Clinton lost and cost her the presidency, I'd say that we've been neglectful, dangerously neglectful of what we need to do in terms of our domestic politics in order to function as a humane leader in global politics. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to start off, in some ways, moving forward on your point. The refugee program in the United States has been the largest in the world, but quiet for the most part. Nobody paid a lot of attention to it except for those who were resettling until 2015, when two events are the poles of where we are now. One, of course, are people walking through the forests of Europe to get to Germany, but a small boy dies, washes up on shore on a beach, and that picture galvanized people's sympathy and an attention to refugees. The other pole, of course, is a terror attack in Paris, where one of the perpetrators has a Syrian passport in his back pocket. And you have to ask yourself, if you are going out to kill yourself, do you say, my passport, I'll need that? And so days after the event, people said this was a plant. This was part of the propaganda of ISIS to lay that blame on Syrian refugees. So those are the two poles, and you saw two reactions. My question is, are we at a moment in this country where we will contract that refugee program for good? And if that is not true, what are the ways that you all propose moving forward on Richard's point, to make that refugee program more relevant to Americans, to explain to them why it is that America does it, and what the public good is for bringing refugees to this country? And I'm going to invite the panel behind me to also, if they wish to speak, they can too. And if you'll put your paper up.
I can say something from my personal experience as a Syrian refugee from Egypt. The program itself takes years for background check. Even for me, because I don't have a husband, my case was supposed to be expedited. It took about 2 years. A lot of questions, a lot of interviews, even they asked me about my grandfather. So it's not easy to come to United States as a refugee, as a lot of people think that everybody can come easily or everybody can pay money or buy a visa to come as a refugee to United States. The program is really strong, and I am with it because United States now my country, and also I need safety for me and for others Americans. But I really feel sad when I see a lot of Americans, they don't know anything about the refugee program, and they start asking, how did you escape to our country? How did you arrive? They surprised. I didn't jump in from Syria to United States like this. It was a lot of process, and seriously, I didn't know where they will let me resettle. They didn't tell me it's United States. It was kind of secret until before I traveled about 7 days, they told me you got resettled to United States. Can you imagine someone do a lot of interviews without knowing where he is going? They didn't tell me. It's kind of secret, which is, for me, it was a big surprise because I love United States since I was in Syria because of the movies. But anyways, but it's kind of surprise. So I really want people to understand that the process is really strong, even before the new political situation and the new things about, security and stuff. The resettlement program is really strong, and there is a lot of question, a lot of documents. We never came without passport. We have our own paperwork. We provide to UNHCR. In case we don't have it, they don't resettle us. So we are known. We are not somebody just changing our name and changing our date of birth and coming as a refugee. This is not a true idea.
Yeah, hi. Will Does it come on automatically?
Yeah, there it goes.
Okay. My name is Ann Richard, and I'm on the afternoon panel, but I think I'll speak now because I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration and responsible for the program that brought refugees to the United States in conjunction with many good non-governmental organizations, the International Organization for Migration and the UN Refugee Agency. And in the Obama administration, we were bringing 70,000 refugees to the United States per year for several years when the White House decided we must do more. And as Deborah points out, the death of Alan Kurdi and the way his photo became viral around the world really prompted people to call for more. There were, many, many voices saying we have to do more for refugees. And the Obama administration, which had already been thinking about raising the numbers, did end up proposing 85,000 come in the fiscal year 2016, which was something that was accomplished, and then was proposing 110,000. At the same time, there were countervailing voices that were concerned about who these people were. And for me, one of the most bruising weeks of my life was the week between November 13th, when the Paris attacks happened, and Thanksgiving of November 2015, because all of a sudden, Congress's concerns about refugees really came to the fore. And there were at least 6 hearings that I appeared at. And their concerns, which are really captured in the debate over a bill that they introduced that week. They introduced a bill on Tuesday morning and voted to approve it by Thursday afternoon that would have really essentially halted the arrival of refugees in the United States. They were concerned there was no vetting or weak vetting of the refugees, which was not at all true. As Secretary Albright has said, it's the most extensive vetting of any traveler to the United States. They didn't know who these folks were. And particularly damaging was FBI Director Comey saying, we have no files on these people. And no one stopped to say, well, why should the FBI have files on poor Syrians walking out of their country to Jordan, fleeing bombing? That they are particularly dangerous. That we ought to check. I actually had members of Congress say to me, we should check with Assad to see their backgrounds and if they've been criminals inside Syria. And I was just so flabbergasted at the idea that the person who was the torturer-in-chief of these poor people would have a say in whether they became refugees. There was a concern that ISIS had announced, and this is probably true, that they would exploit the program to get terrorists in. And that was a big concern. And also, there was argued from another point that this was just a pause. And we've heard this from the Trump administration. But I think that it was more than that. I think that at the root, for some people, it was this belief that Muslims would not fit in the United States. And this is, of course, not only insulting to all the Muslim adherents around the world, but also Muslim Americans. And, that it turned out is really echoed from things in our history. We have this wonderful history of taking in refugees and immigrants, but we also have a history of wanting to close the door after the last group that's come in. And that, I think, is part of what we're seeing today.
Anybody else? Let me ask the larger question of 65 million in the world. 65 million displaced, one of the biggest international crises that the international community faces. We were much more focused on it a year ago. Europe has figured out how to close its borders. We don't really see the coverage that we did. We don't see the vests. We don't see the boats. That has been tidied up, so to speak. How should the world respond to this crisis that, as you say, is only getting larger? And if you could put your name tags up so I can see who wants to talk. And we'll start with you, Haki.
So just to go a bit on that direction, but deeper on climate change, I think this is where if we ask what we need to to do and be active. I think this country needs to stay true and committed to the climate change agreement. Deconstructing the fear, it's going to be extremely important that the refugees are not seen as the threat and the risk, and this notion of individual responsibility. If somewhere there is a crime, then everybody can be considered a criminal and a terrorist, which has been nurtured in this country since 9/11. In one way or another, the idea of collective guilt has been nurtured in one way or another. And I know it's not simple to be addressed, but I think people, citizens, students, everybody can work around. Why that goes in the direction that the question is being asked. I don't think there is going to be a perfect solution unless we go back to a proper, accountable international development interventions where people are empowered to live where they are, and they are the ones to choose their own representation and leadership. And I think we saw what that means when people start doing it in Egypt, and then when international big players get back and really actually not be helpful in the case. We are seeing it in Syria on what it means for us to think that all Syrians are crazy and they are infighting, but actually the decisions are made somewhere else, and who is maintaining the proxy war in Syria. We need to go back and reconsider if we want to address the issue of refugees. If we want to address long-term peace and stability in the world, we need to go back and ask the question of governance and allow for people to be the ones to direct their political agenda rather than geopolitics doing there. The other thing is, if we go deep enough, what are we doing? It's actually empowering exactly the extremist organized crime groups and people who are danger to the world's peace. And this needs to be explained to the Americans and Europeans, that by closing the borders, by creating agreements between Turkey and Europe, what you're actually doing is creating a huge illegal economic opportunity for organized crime and extremists to weaponize and use and create viable industry out of refugees and movements of people. So we are nurturing, we're giving the support to the extremists and terrorists and corruptive networks in the world by doing this. So being able to engage deep without fear in those issues, I think it's going to be critical to come up for being able to come up with solutions. And I still think that even us who are open to the refugees, people who talk about democracy in the world and fundamental principles of a liberal society, we're still not going deep enough because we are also discussing at some level of fear about which side are we going to contribute. And I'm not saying there are leadership that is emerging more and more because of Trump and building walls and all these ideas that are, nobody ever believed that they will be part of the 21st century. But I think there's a need for even stronger and clearer leadership on tackling those fundamental issues that I'm talking about.
Hang on 1 minute, because I want to ask Madeleine something. We've been talking about governance for a long time. The problem is if we wait for good governance, it simply has not been addressed. So is there something else you can do while you're waiting?
Well, it's interesting. I just made a note to myself, is that what we need are short, medium, and long-term action plans. Because there has to be immediate relief for some of the people out of the humanitarian aspects, and medium in terms of how public-private partnerships, et cetera, work together. Governance is hard, and Haki, you're from Bosnia. Basically, people are still arguing over something that we thought that we had managed to solve by probably the most complicated governance plan Dayton ever constructed. And it's very hard, but I do think that I was planning to kind of think about for later today how we talk about short, medium, and long term, because the governance part is really hard, especially in the United States. So I think
And in the Middle East.
Right.
No.
Great, thank you, Deborah. I just wanted to also emphasize that Syria is one of the current crises. But one of the challenges we've had is that there have been several global refugee crises, and we're now living at the highest levels of displacement on record, an unprecedented 65.3 million people around the world. And so the reason why I raise that is two issues. One is we're talking about a fully saturated region when you're looking at the Middle East and North Africa. Haki already mentioned the Palestinian refugee crisis, but you had Iraq, you had the 2006 Lebanon war. And so this movement has made the region saturated, which is why it's pouring into Europe, but it means that it can't be just local or regional solutions. It really needs to be global solutions. The other reason why I mention this is because with the current administration, the fact that we keep using Syria as an example also turns the refugees into targets. So we have to be careful to make sure that it's not the only focus. And finally, the economic effect is always a huge issue, particularly for host nations. And I would just, there is a great World Bank study, 2 years actually in a row, looking at the effect of trade in Lebanon. And it's a really good example of how complex it is and how refugees come out as assets, but no one wants to talk about it in that way. And so I would just say from the economic perspective, it's really important to look at the nuances of what conflict does to economies, which also creates opportunities.
I'm going to go deeply into the weeds here and ask the economist in the room who spoke about Rust Belt cities who are losing populations. Sure. Some have embraced refugees and immigration as an answer. Upstate New York has revived their economy. Cincinnati is looking at this. Minneapolis is passing legislation to allow professionals to be relicensed when they come as immigrants. Why is it that some Rust Belts embrace and some Rust Belts completely turn the other way?
I think it's a question of our perception rather than the reality on the ground. That is, we've gotten ourselves in a habit of thinking of red and blue states and red and blue people, and we have allowed ourselves to think that there is the other, which exists as our fellow citizens. And in any of those states, in Ohio, in Minneapolis, in Iowa, in upstate New York, there is always a mix of people, some of whom are more open to the idea of resettlement of refugees within that community, others fearful. What we have to do is figure out how the balance of the politics works and where we can develop models and broadcast information about those models that are working. The relicensing of professionals is almost too easy because we all want doctors, we all want accountants, we all want, professionals. And part of the way that American immigration reform was reformed in the 1960s was to place this emphasis on the admission of professionals and pre-professionals. I mean, as you may know, by religion, the wealthiest religious grouping in the United States today are Hindu Americans, in no small part because many of them came to MIT as physicists or to Harvard as medical school students, and of course have accelerated quite rapidly within the society. But you have tiered bodies of refugees and immigrants coming in at different socioeconomic levels. And what you hear from so many in the Rust Belt who chose to vote for Trump is that the targeted impact is predominantly within that blue-collar range, not within the professional range. And so I'm not so worried about the professionals and how well they'll adapt. They'll do fine. What I want to do is figure out a policy that provides more for American blue-collar workers who have paid too high a price for the path of globalization that we have followed over the last 30 years, which does not mean abandoning global trade or globalization, but requires much more detailed attention to the capture of some of the windfall profits and their rechanneling or their recirculation into those areas that have paid the price.
Do you think they're taking it out on immigrants and refugees?
So again, that's too broad a statement. I mean, sure, some are, and we see horrific stories of individuals attacking refugees here and there, but by and large, no. I mean, we've got Pew data that says that most Americans don't think that immigrants are a danger or a net negative to the United States. I mean,
I just meant voting patterns, not in violence.
Huh?
I meant in voting patterns, not in violence.
I think we're going to have to ride this cycle out. I think what we got in Donald Trump was the expression by the American people of one more cycle of wanting real change. They feel somehow that Washington is too far away from their needs, their interests, their understanding of the way the world works. They voted for Barack Obama because they wanted change. They voted for Donald Trump because they wanted change. If you can't hold that in your mind, then you don't understand the complexity of America. This is a country that's capable of voting both men into office, thinking of them both as change agents.
I just wanted to go back to the numbers question you asked, right? So there are so many people in need here, and I think that the response, even on the part of progressives, to those numbers is sometimes a kind of moral panic, right? It's like there are so many people we need to help, and, you know, we have our own interests to deal with too. How can we handle this without being, like, seriously harmed ourselves? So I think there's two things I want to say about that kind of reaction, which I think we should take seriously. So one is, there are many different duties that you could distinguish towards refugees. So the first duty recognized in international law is just this duty of non-refoulement. So if a refugee comes to your border seeking asylum, then you need to take in that person and process their application. But beyond that, there are duties to ensure durable solutions to the problem, which often will involve admission. But there's also duties to refugees in other countries who haven't admitted, who are nonetheless, you know, in very difficult situations, say in camps. There are ways for people who are external to the situation to assist people that don't involve just taking them in. So I think it's important to realize that even if there are political concerns about admission, there are other ways to assist too that go beyond admission. We need to think about those. A second point is that I do think these concerns that Richard raised about the interests of citizens, existing citizens, are really important. So we have very strong duties to people outside our own state, but we also have duties to our fellow citizens who are, you know, disadvantaged in various ways. And there are cases where those can come into conflict, and we need to take seriously the domestic duties and the global ones. You know, morally, not just, I think, politically, obviously, but also morally. Yeah. But what I think, you know, is important about this case is it's not, as we've been discussing, clear that there is a strong conflict in this particular area. In others, there might be. But in the case of immigration in general, it often will be the case that admitting immigrants as full members will benefit citizens as well. So this should not be as hard as some of the other situations where we have domestic and global conflicts in terms of moral responsibilities.
Let me ask you about an argument that I hear in Washington, and these are from migration specialists who lean towards the Trump argument. And they take the example of Syrians. We let in 12,000. There are 5 million Syrians who need resettlement. It is a pittance. Why not? Why take 1 out of 12? Let them win the lottery, come to America. Why not take any, but use the money internationally to make sure that Jordan has a more equitable employment scheme for refugees, or Lebanon can build more schools because that's where the refugees are going to be, or help Turkey, who, these are the states that are you know, having the most burden. And instead of having the disruption of refugees, which is how they argue it, let's put our money in the international system and make sure that that's a safer place for refugees. Is that a reasonable argument to make?
No. First of all, I don't think it's a reasonable argument, and some of our role in the international system is to be a model and not to shuck our responsibilities. So that's one part. Plus, I actually do believe that refugees, I look at them, we've done a lot of things together, and she talks, and she will, about the advantage of refugees, that they really can be seen as a positive, and I hope you really make that case again. And by the way, I have spent a lot of time driving across America. It is a big place. We have plenty of room. And the interesting part is, I think Americans are exceptionally generous with a short attention span. And so the issue is understanding that this is something that we can do. I also do think, you take Jordan as an example. I've been to Jordan. Jordan has refugees from Palestine, from Syria and Iraq. They are a frontline state. with a government that is generally okay, but also kind of tippy in a number of issues that they have. It isn't a matter of money there. It's a matter of numbers, where King Abdullah will come and say, if the United States had the equivalent in ratio of what we have, you would have 60 million refugees come in here. So I don't think that would work. I do think, as I said in my opening remarks, there's something about the international system that does need work, not just money, but also governance of the international system. President Obama, it was interesting, at the General Assembly, there was a refugee summit, which Ban Ki-moon led, where every country came. And then President Obama had decided that he would only invite those countries that actually were going to be helpful, and also a private sector. And I think that's a better way of incentivizing others to help and to see the advantage of it. And I hope we get to what the role of the private sector is in this. And the private sector being both the businesses as well as the NGOs, because it isn't just a government activity.
Yes, on this issue, perhaps my perspective from Germany, where in 2015, 850,000 people arrived in Germany. The government decided to spend, on the federal level, 22 billion a year. This is meant for the next 5 years, each year, to try to integrate. But at the same time, it is clear that no democratic government anywhere in the world can make this effort without having a strategy how to control the borders. So at the same time, Chancellor Merkel played the key role in trying to negotiate with Turkey on having a way of controlling arrivals that is in line with the Refugee Convention, so no pushbacks, and giving, and this is the question you asked, 6 billion euros from the European Union to Turkey for dealing with refugees in the country. This is spent through international organizations. And I was just in Ankara talking to UN officials, and they say that in the last 15 months, the number of children in schools in Turkey, Syrian children, has more than doubled. It used to be 230,000. It's now more than 500,000. Some say 600,000. Now, 6 billion euros a year for one country, sorry, not for 1 year, for a few years, but for one country. I mean, Ann Richards knows how much that is, because the US budget, I think, each year is $3 billion. Here, the EU gives 6 billion just for one country. The problem is, this is too rare. I mean, here we have a humanitarian crisis. There is serious money. It is making an impact. But we have nothing comparable for Lebanon and nothing comparable for Jordan. But this is the kind of policy that we need. And in order to make it politically viable, it needs to be combined with control of the borders. Otherwise, you will not get the budgets in the Bundestag or in the Swedish parliaments to be voted through. And otherwise, you have the far right coming up, which says the simple solution is just push everyone back.
Yes, you can. Manal first.
So, Deborah, that was my point with the region being fully saturated. It can't take more, but the other issue is recognizing the numbers lead to more potential future conflicts, because you're creating demographic shifts. And so right now, Jordanians are probably the third population in their own country, and that creates challenges. And then with the sectarian, the only way to really help refugees is to solve the political conflict.
Haki.
Just to second, that is the solution. But you know, the issue of dealing with Turkey, as an example, is like, why do refugees have to pay the price of visa liberalization for Turkish citizens? You know, fundamentally, when the deal was done, it was the 6 billion for Turkey to deal with refugees, which were created because of the interest moving in the region. But part of that discussion and negotiation was for Turkish citizens to get visa-free regime. So it just interferes the technicality of dealing with refugees with the fundamental principles of humanity. That's what we're talking about here. The freedom of globalization has been captured by the idea that you can actually move the goods around, but when it comes to helping people and supporting people, globalization is not at equal basis. So it's okay to be in the markets of Ukraine, but when it comes to dealing with Ukraine, you need to deal through geopolitics with Russia and other aspects. That's where when I say governance, I don't mean only governance at the national level. I mean international governance that has been perpetuating the conflict around the world. And I agree, it's a long-term addressing, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be starting now. and not wait while we're dealing with emergencies and issues that are even going to be, I think, greater if the decisions in Europe are going to go more right, as we're seeing, and potential new alliance between Trump and Putin, which are going to put yet again another element of complexity to this already prepared field of white against Muslims, or Muslims and Christians are clashing in order to basically, what I believe fundamentally is the new era of a exploitation of resources in the times of climate change and losing lands and scarce resources around the world. So being ready not to question our fundamental values, as we did in the negotiation with Turkey, but rather move forward swiftly with the idea that there will be leaders in the world and there will be people like you sitting here who are going to stand up for the freedom of movement and for the freedom of people to move the same way as goods move in the world.
Joanna?
I would like to see, from the perspective of having covered this from Greece, more resources given to various European Union countries, especially Greece, in dealing with the problem that is happening and there's the political conflict may be years away in solving, and right now we have the problem happening in real time. Greece has problems with management of resources. They have for years. And that's one reason why camps, for example, aren't functioning as well as they should be. But it's also, from the very beginning of what I saw in Greece, the European Union did not back a fellow member state enough in dealing with this crisis. And since the resettlement plans have come into motion, there also hasn't been, Germany has done, I think, a very good job of resettling refugees there, but other countries either don't understand the buy-in, like why should I have even 1,000 refugees come live in my country? I mean, Slovakia just freaked out when something like 1,500 refugees are supposed to go there, and there's no buy-in, and that's a whole other separate conversation that has to do with what we do on like the very basic community level, convincing people that it means getting out of our comfort zone, essentially, convincing people that this is not a big deal, that we can do it. But it's also, as far as resources, at this point, that's something I'd like to see in Greece, happening in Greece and in the European Union, and a better conversation taking place on how to, every member state needs to be helping. It's not a matter of like, I can't take 500 refugees because it's against whatever crazy idea the latest politician has come up with, so.
Yeah, in listening to the panelists, was thinking about the importance of diplomacy to resolve crises. And one of the unfortunate things is that we have seen that we have too many crises and we have too few that are being resolved. And while it is, aid is something that you can devote money to and see a short-term impact of helping people, diplomacy, as Secretary knows better than anyone, takes a long time, and you can have setbacks and you can have advances you didn't expect. And it's very, very hard, though, there's so many factors to it. It's very, very hard to control where it's going to come out and to guarantee for success. We were just talking about the EU-Turkey deal, the vast amount of resources going behind that for one country, the sort of callous nature fueling, here we'll give you money, you keep them from coming to our shores. I am actually the signatory of what the current president has said is the worst deal ever, and also called dumb, which was a deal to take refugees from Australia. And many people who are purer and more idealistic than me would say they should go to Australia. We should not make it easier on the Australians to pursue this terrible policy they have of refusing to, terrible yet popular in Australia policy of refusing to allow refugees to land by boat on their shores. By instituting this policy, it's been very effective of keeping people from making that dangerous sea voyage. My intent in signing this terrible deal, badly negotiated deal, was that we got to get those people off those islands. We got to get them off Manus Island in Papua New Guinea and the country of Nauru because their situation is so terrible. So I stopped short of the ideal because I thought for those individuals, something was better than nothing.
Let me just ask one more question, and then we're going to open it to the floor, and that's to Asma. Do you think that Syrians reading the news that America is closing its doors, do you think that has anything to do with their decisions when they leave their homes and flee with their kids?
No, for sure not. Actually, when we didn't choose to be outside of country. And let me ask you something. If, God forbid, and you had a problem in your country, and you have in your country your family, your friend, your work, your university, your dreams, your memories, is it really, easy decision to choose to leave? It is not. For me, particularly, I am inspired by American life because of the movies, and I start making decisions, and I complete my study after I get married when I was 14. So I studied until I had a university, until I started studying a master's degree in Damascus University, and I was a professor assistant there in the same time. And it wasn't an easy decision for me to say, okay, I will leave everything behind, my family, my mom and dad, and my old sister there in Syria, and my old memories and friends, and my home, and just go outside. It's not an easy decision, but I make it because I'm not safe for with my kids, so I need safety. So I choose to leave behind everything. And I went to Egypt, and of course, talking about solving the problem in any close area to Syria, it is not, because in Egypt you are not allowed to work, or in Jordan, as a refugee, you are not allowed to work. And in case I got harassed in Egypt and nobody helped me from the police, they said, if you are not safe, go back to your country. So here I am safe. If somebody did something bad, at least I can go to the police and I have voice. They will go and help me. So coming to United States is not easy for us as a Syrian, and it's not a choice. We forced to be outside, and the only thing we need welcome, because welcoming really help us to integrate. And I always do that to my client, when the Syrian client, when they arrive to United States and see the difference between the culture, and everything is different than Syria. And they said, please, I want you to love this country. Whenever you love this country, it will be easy to integrate. It's not only about learning English, it's not only about learning the culture. Whenever you love this country, you will be really easy for you. It will be easy for you to integrate and give, not only take. So I believe when all refugees, when they arrive, especially from Syria, in Boise, Idaho, we are only 50 families. And whenever Idaho people or American people ask me, how many Syrian refugees in Boise, Idaho? And I said, only 50 families. Wow, only? So they think maybe we are more than 10,000 in Boise, Idaho. So they feel really afraid of us. And then when we have a meeting together and we, drink tea together or coffee, oh, wow, they change their mind. So only when you open a little bit their mind to others, they will enjoy. I enjoyed a lot of having time with a lot of American families because I learned more about their culture. No matter if they are Muslims or Christian or Jewish, I don't care. I just enjoy my time, and I enjoy my food with them, and I just enjoy it. And I need people really to enjoy having refugee because they learned a lot from their culture. And, that's why I love United States, because you cannot see only American. You see all people from around the world in one place, which is great. That's make America great, and it's great always. It doesn't need to be great again for me.
Let me now Let me now call on the audience. Those of you who have questions, I think that there are microphones set up on either side here. Come down, just introduce yourself, please, and ask your questions. And we'll go both sides of the room. And the first one up. Yep.
Thank you very much. This was a very sobering session, for sure. My question has to do with trying to find out as far as we can, the source of the problem. I think we will all agree that what has created at least the current crisis that we are mostly focusing on goes back to the Iraq War. I don't think we will find anymore too many people who will think that this was a just war. This was definitely a terribly thought and war that has terrible consequences, and what we see now is this particular crisis. Go a little further back in history, you will see other wars that created the problems of refugees being permanent, from the Palestinian state in Jordan and many other places. So my question has to do with how do we deal as a democracy with that? Because it seems that the solutions we're coming up with are within the nation. So we were unhappy with the choices of a particular government, so a new government comes in, and somehow we feel that the problem is solved while we're living behind a situation which can go on for years and years and years and give rise to new situations. We seem not to have the ability at an international level to come in and provide the justice that is so much needed to solve the problem that we're dealing. Is it so?
Anybody?
So, Professor Metaxas, I don't think that this started recently with the Iraq War, the earlier Gulf War. I think it started with the discovery of oil in the Middle East at the beginning of the 20th century. From an economist's point of view, these are countries that are suffering from what's called a resource curse. And the resource curse is to be a population sitting on top of an extraordinarily valuable asset for the developed world. It has then been further complicated by foreign policy choices that were made by Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and today by Russia as well, too, that have sought to impose effectively great power control over the allocation and mining or production of that resource. The tragedy for me, in terms of watching the development of the region, is the series of Arab Springs that have risen, hopefully, and collapsed. We are now at a very, very difficult period because providing those within those communities with the hope that their attempts at political reform will achieve political reform is more attenuated than in any time in the past.
Yeah, I think you forgot France too. As part of
sorry,
that.
left France out. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I mean, it's very hard at the same time, very simple. I think the idea of you're son of a bitch, but you're our son of a bitch has to finish. And unless we get to the point where I said, think long term, do immediate measures that help that long term be achieved, which is delivering on the promise of democracy. And I think this is what Richard is talking about. Revolutions in the street can take 2 days, but the reforms can take forever. We need plans in hands to be able to support the real true leaders who are not just going to speak about rhetorically about transparency and accountability, but actually are going to live by those standards and are kept to the standards by international institutions and big states as well. Instead of trying to use shortcuts. There is no such thing as shortcut in democracy. We know that. It's complicated, it is expensive, but there is no other way to govern, either at the national or international levels.
Well, yeah, this is working?
Yeah.
I was a refugee once also in my life, but then I also, at a later stage, a few years ago, was Prime Minister of Greece. I just want to make a simple, but I think an important point when we're talking about this issue, particularly myself coming from Europe, but also seeing what's happening here with Trump in the United States. I remember when I was in very difficult times, I would say, I just want to go off to a Greek island. I'm going to sit there, I'm going to be isolated, I'll pull out my guitar, I'll eat my Greek cheese and yogurt and drink wine and fish and so on. And I remember going onto this beautiful little island called Agathonisi, which actually translated means the island of virtue. Had 156 people living on it, 2 taverns, beautiful beaches. I said, well, this would be a nice spot to stay. But of course I had visited that, and that was some years ago, it wasn't in 2015, because about 200 refugees had just landed on the beaches. And if you also looked down into the beautiful waters to look at the ruins, you would also see that a lot of the industrial world had left some of its wastes, plastic bags and so on. And climate change had also brought different types of fish from the south. So what is the very simple, but I think very important conclusion? We are not an island. We cannot be an island. Now, you have Brexit in the European Union, you have building a wall here. That won't work. We have to engage with the world. Now, the solutions may not be simple, and they certainly are not as simple as building a wall. But we have to engage with the world. We have to engage and find solutions. We have to regulate some of these problems. Obviously, the root causes, what Madeleine was saying earlier, Secretary Albright, very, very much the short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And the short-term is to see how we deal with the humanitarian crisis, and there we all should share our burden. But the second is then to think more deeply about these root causes and long-term processes. And I remember as a refugee in Sweden, young refugee then, there was quite a robust program of how we were integrated. It was well planned. I had to learn the language. They would offer skills and training if you didn't have the skills and training to get into a job, integrating into society. But that means resources. That means we do need to bring resources. It also allowed us to, and this is, I think, another thing is, we have to see a refugee as an opportunity. A refugee is coming, leaving, as was said earlier, because they have to, but they also are change agents. They want to go back. They would want to see their country very differently. Why not come to the United States and learn from the United States? As I went to Sweden, I went to Canada, I've lived here also. Why not learn? And then at some point, maybe they'll go back to be the new architects and engineers of their own countries in building. So there would be a lost opportunity to say, let's just keep them just in that area, which is maybe a makeshift solution for a period of time. But I've been to Jordan also, I've been to these countries. They cannot hold that large number of population for so many years. And the Palestinians, how many years are the Palestinians now refugees in Jordan and in Lebanon? Since 1948, and many of them in camps since then. That's an untenable situation. So I think we really have to engage and see in finding solutions.
Can you still speak Swedish?
Yes, I can.
Question from the side of the room.
Hello, my name is Misha Lurska, and I'm a first year at this best college in the world. And so my question focuses more on the domestic side and what we can do as everyday people to help. So in the 50s, there was this American author from Georgia called Flannery O'Connor who wrote a short story called The Displaced Person, who wrote about basically Polish refugees coming into a farm in Georgia and being taken in. And there's this quote from it that I think is really relevant to what's happening today that says, if they had come from a place where such things were done to them, what's to say that they're not going to do the same things to us? And I think this quote is really relevant because we live in an age of fear. Around us, there's a lot of both externalized and internalized racism and fear. And in order to help people and to understand and to make a difference in this refugee crisis, we need empathy because it's only by understanding other people's stories that we can, want to help. But fear in itself kills empathy and breeds hatred. So my question focuses more just on asking, as everyday people, as citizens, as students, and as people who care, how can we kill the hatred and the fear around us? Thank you.
I think the best way to do it is to get out of your comfort zone and go talk to people who feel afraid of refugees or the other, whoever that may be, and talk to them. This is what we're not good at here, or from what I can tell anywhere in the world. In Greece, what I've seen there, and I saw it a lot in Germany too, in covering the refugee story there, is that people do make the effort to get out of their comfort zone. I remember really early on in like 2012 or 2013, there was a priest at this church called Agios Panteleimonas in Athens. Lots of refugees had gathered around that area, and economic migrants as well. And everybody in the neighborhood was afraid. And so as a result, what happened was this neo-Nazi group called Golden Dawn had gathered there and had started telling the residents, they're going to kill you, they're going to hurt you, we'll walk you to the bank, we'll escort you everywhere, and then if you need anything, we'll beat them up. Well, the priest at this church was horrified because not only was he watching his neighborhood being divided, he was helping a lot of the refugees too. They had a soup kitchen. He'd talk to them as much as he could in speaking only English, and he didn't speak Arabic or Dari or whatever other country or whatever other language he could. And you know what? It worked. For a while, that neighborhood was really in the grip of Golden Dawn. But what he did is he would talk not only to the people who supported Golden Dawn, but he would talk to the members of the parties themselves and say, have you actually ever met a refugee other than walking past one on the street and wanting to beat him up? You want to have dinner with us tonight? I'm just having a soup kitchen, sort of like buffet style here, but please come, join us if you want. And to a certain extent, I'm not saying it was a resounding success, but it worked a little bit because it changed people's minds, and that's really the only thing you can do. And in another case in southern Greece, actually in western Greece, at a camp called Mersini, there's actually a Syrian guy who's a mayor in Greece, and he did the same thing there. He's Syrian. He's like, I got to take in Syrians. I'm going to make a really nice camp here for them. But he would go and also talk to people who did support Golden Dawn. And in fact, he got people who were Golden Dawn supporters and sometimes Golden Dawn members to sponsor families. They were like giving all their extra money to help families in this refugee camp. And he did that simply by getting out of his comfort zone, risking getting yelled at, risking being called all sorts of names and making himself uncomfortable, and saying, okay, tell me why. Why do you not like these people? I just want to know why. He and the priest did exactly that. And it works. It's uncomfortable for a while, but it works. And I think that's one step you can do just as one person.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, Misha. I thought that was a really good question, and I'm glad we're going to see each other at 8:30 tomorrow morning in comparative politics, because this is the subject of class tomorrow, and I think...
Wait, should we all come?
Yeah, Pendleton has a lot of space in it, and so I think the example that was just given kind of reiterates what Bob Putnam has talked about for quite a long time in his books like Bowling Alone and Making Democracy Work, which is that we have to work, and I do believe that there is a role for elite level politics and a global solution. But wherever you are, there you are. And part of Putnam's argument is that civil society should be robust, and that everyday citizens have an opportunity to build trust with one another. And it doesn't have to be a protest. It could be as simple as having an association, a cooking group, in which you're inviting members of the community that you don't necessarily know. These could be refugees. These could be people from another part of the political spectrum, where all you share is a common love of having a full stomach and delicious food. But these types of conversations that you could develop while sharing a meal together, for example, or having a bowling league or a bird watching group. Any of these types of small groups are places where you will encounter problems with one another and learn to compromise and find solutions. How to best cook a chicken, how long you should cook your rice. Arabs have a long debate over how rice should be cooked. Well, if you can solve an argument over how to cook rice best, it could translate to something else in the political realm. And I think those trust relationships that you can initiate on this campus with refugees living on this campus is one way to begin overcoming the hate.
Anybody else?
On the domestic front, and I think the panel this afternoon will talk a little bit more about what to do, what can be done. But on the domestic front, I think one of the real issues about which there's disagreement is how much risk are we willing to live with in our lives? And there is a sentiment among some on Capitol Hill that any risk is too much, and they don't want to be responsible. None of us wants to be responsible after a horrible terror attack for having let that person in or having somehow sold that person fertilizer. And so there, for some, clearly there was too much risk having a refugee program if only one person brought out of thousands in 1 year, or 3.3 million since the Vietnam era, was going to cause a lot of damage. And we've learned one person or a handful of people can do a lot of damage. I admired Governor Jay Inslee of Washington, because the Monday after the Paris attacks, he said, you take a risk getting out of bed every morning. And I think that really is more of a courageous statement than what we were hearing from other leaders. We also heard in France, Hollande said, we're going to take 30,000 Syrians. Now, he's not a viable candidate for re-election, but it was the right thing, I think, at the right moment. But I think this issue is sort of underlies some of the discussion that we've been having this morning.
Thank you. This side of the room?
Hi, my name is Asmaa Albukaie. I'm a professor of mathematics here at the greatest college in the world. I'm also a Bosnian refugee. Came here in the early 90s, so I first want to thank you, Madam Secretary, for all the hard work you did for stopping that terrible war. However, the peace agreement, as you alluded earlier, that was put in place, created conditions that were just unsustainable, and Bosnia is still not a place of progress in any sense of the word. Half of us do not live in Bosnia. Half the Bosnian population lives outside of Bosnia, and more young people are still trying to leave the country, and are doing so in droves. My question is just, if you can sort of project 4 or 20 years from now, as a result of this administration's actions, where do you see sort of humanitarian crises or the Syrian crisis in particular, in some foreseeable future?
I'm very good at explaining the past. And the projecting aspect, I think, is difficult in the following way, that this administration has taken as one of its goals to make us afraid, because it is based on that fear factor that they are making the decisions or pretending or whatever. But it is the opposite, basically, of what you were saying in terms of us all trying to figure out who we are and having empathy. Instead, you're supposed to look at somebody who doesn't look exactly like you and decide to be afraid of them. And if the policy is to do that, then it creates more problems. I do think that it would be good to think about political settlements in these places. And one of the issues, I have many hats, and one is I'm chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, and one of the arguments has always been is, what do we do first, political change or economic development? I mean, there are a lot of classes that we all took trying to decide what went ahead of what. They go together because democracy has to deliver. People want to vote and eat. And so the question is how to have programs of some kind that make it possible for people to live in their own countries and feel that they are taken care of. The Arab Spring, I've now spent a lot of time on that, and the issue there is that there's no system in order how to get from Tahrir Square to governance. And part of it, some of it is our fault, frankly, because we thought, the United States, that the Egyptians should have elections right away. The truth was the Muslim Brotherhood was organized. The other people were not that were in Tahrir Square. And so you get the Muslim Brotherhood elected, and that creates a variety of issues. So we need to think a little bit more about our policies in Iraq. The pre-previous administration, the Bush people made a mistake by deciding that they were not going to push Maliki. And so there are an awful lot of political decisions that are made that need to be reviewed. But I do think one thing, in defense of short-termism sometime, Dayton happened because there were a series of issues that had to be dealt with right there in terms of how the Serbs and the Bosnians and the Croats were going to get along. And it was a quick solution that should have had language in it about review when the situation changed. And that's the problem, is what you do in this is why I thought we need to talk about short, medium, and long. How is it that you take a short decision that does not preclude different activities in the medium and the long term? And at the moment, I think we don't have the answers to any of that and are afraid to talk about it. But what is most troubling to me right now is that we have an administration that the only thing we actually hope for is that it's disorganized. The fact that they couldn't get this ban through any kind of an interagency system is what allowed there a certain amount of time. But basically, we have a president who is has some relationship with whoever Bannon is, Rasputin, basically in terms of some longer range plan that we're going to have an entirely different system of government. So I think it is time for us to stand up on some of these very basic human principles, decide what we're going to do short, medium, and long term.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Question on this side.
I'm Lori Amy. I'm an American citizen, but I'm actually here with an Albanian organization, Autonomy. This is an urgent discussion, and I am grateful for the organizers and the speakers that have made it possible. My question gets to moral responsibility. So, if I understood, Mr. Parker, your analysis correctly, we are in a position such that the psyche of the Trump presidency has taken political power in part through a failure of moral responsibility to the domestic politics, in which blue-collar and working-class voters are alienated and disenfranchised. And that in order to take the moral responsibility to the immigrant refugee other, we have to first take moral responsibility in this country. Okay, I take that seriously. Now here is a perversion at the root of that, though. The alienation and the disenfranchisement in a highly technologized information knowledge economy is precisely a product of the policies of the 1% in a global war economy, which, as Haki points out, creates for us the global crises facing us. So the same disenfranchised voters listening to the rhetoric, blaming the victims of the policies of the 1%, are voting for the person that created the problem.
And the question? I said, and your question?
The question is, how do we take the moral responsibility for that psychotic split in this country, which is much more than a simple strategizing for political place,
Richard?
Great speech. I agree with almost all of it. And my point was not about sequencing a favoring of the domestic over the international, but insisting that when we think about the international, we think clearly about the domestic constraints operating on international choice. So that's a different construct than you imputed to me, and I want to make that clear. The second is that I think that President Trump is actually creating the conditions where some of your questions might be answered, but not in the next 2 months, but over the next several years. We've just seen Democrats win a state Senate race in Delaware by overwhelming numbers because Democratic activists and supporters of politics opposed to Trump are so mobilized right now. If that can be sustained and that can be spread across the country, then I think that will create part of the conditions for it. But as Secretary Albright knows, or as any of us knows, it also is a question of what the configuration intellectually and ideologically of the Democratic Party going forward will be. The 2016 platform was one of the most interesting platforms that I've seen the Democrats produce, and probably the most interesting that I've seen the Democrats produce in my lifetime. And I was born the day that Richard Nixon was first elected to public office, so I've had a long and sometimes painful lifetime. But I don't bemoan the situation, and I don't believe that history is ending with Trump or Trumpism triumphant. I think that this is a decade of transition, but it will eventuate in the coming decades in directions that are going to be set by the activities that all of us carry out now. So I would broadly thank you for your statement. I would broadly agree with it, and we have to work harder.
I just wanted to add to what, and answer also, but to add to what Richard said, and what I see in Europe and many parts of the world, globalization has created problems for parts of our society. Absolutely. There are parts of our society that have been left behind, whether it's the high tech that has destroyed or changed jobs or will even do it more, whether it is blue-collar workers, whether it is high unemployment we have in some parts of Europe. Greece, for example, we have huge unemployment. We have not only the 1%, but we have the capacity now in a globalized society where large corporations basically no longer are part of what used to be called here the Grand Deal or the social contract, where workers, employers, and government together said, okay, we're a capitalist system, we have profits, but there's a responsibility towards our society and infrastructure, health, education, good wages, and so on, unemployment and things like that. Capital moves, and it moves to tax havens, it moves to offshores, it moves to places which have no standards, no labor standards, no environmental standards, no health systems, and that has created huge inequalities. Now, what has happened politically, and this is, I think, what we have to think about, is that the extreme has been able to tap into these injustices and say, you know who's wrong? Who's the problem? It's those guys out there, those migrants, those refugees, they are the problem. So I think we have to reverse that. And we have to say, refugees, migrants, and people who feel injustices in our society or the inequalities, we have something in common. We need to unite. We need to see our common humanity against these injustices. Let's not juxtapose the refugee problem with the injustices in our society. If we do that, we are just going to play in to the Trumps around the world, and they're going to build walls. We're not going to solve the problems. We're going to have deeper problems. So I think this is what our challenge will be politically.
Let me just say, globalization has had many advantages. Most of us are beneficiaries of it. But it has a downside, too. It is faceless. And people feel that they don't belong anywhere, which has given a rise to identity seeking. And we all want to have an identity, whether it's religious, ethnic, linguistic. But when my identity hates your identity, it creates particular problems. And what has happened, patriotism is one thing, nationalism is bad. And hypernationalism is part of the problem here. And we're dealing with that because we don't like foreigners. And the bottom line is when there is an economic problem, you blame the other. That's what's happened. It's a combination of the economic issue and there's somebody to blame. And the hypernationalism is part of the problem.
Question on this side?
Hi, my name is Leonard Keston, and my background is similar to Secretary Albright's. My parents were in Poland during the World War II. I was born in the wreckage of World War II. And as my father used to say to me, I survived Hitler and I survived Stalin, so you should stay out late. He used it all the time. And I ended up in this wonderful country and got to get a graduate degree in the world's greatest university across the river. Let's have the booze, come on. The problem right now, as I see in this country, and I agree with Mr. Parker, a great deal of what he says, is we have to communicate better with the nation. It's easy here in Cambridge. It's easy. I'm married to a Greek family, so I learned that food could have taste. It's easy among us. We all agree with each other. But what do we do? And for me, history is always important. A friend of my mother's was on the St. Louis. Except she made it. The last voyage of the St. Louis, where they made it. For those of you who don't know, it's a ship of Jewish refugees from Europe that came to this country. And in the voyage after my mother's friend, they were turned away by the United States State Department, had to go back to Europe, and most of them died in the Holocaust. And people have to remember that America first, we need to speak, and Secretary Albright's done a great job, we need to speak to the American public and say, this is not the first time we've had America first movements. This is not the first group of people that were turned away. This has come up again and again with the Japanese, with the Jews, with the Palestinians. It comes up again and again, and this is yet another time. And we need, my question is, I don't really have one.
I was just going to ask you that.
I'm going to tell you the truth. I don't really have one, but don't you agree that we need to speak more to the people, you've been saying it, to the people that are on the other side, to explain to them what's really going on here, not that we're all the other at some point. Everybody comes here and they pull up the ladders. But that history, this is history repeating itself, and these are good people, and this country has to stand on its principles. That's what we need to do.
Anybody? Some of us have them in our families, and that's where we start and learn how to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah, I grew up in North Dakota. I'm Greek, and we were the only Greek family that I knew of. Everyone thought we were Mexican and speak to us in Spanish. And it was really hard for my parents to be the other. Once they figured out we were Greek, they would be like the little Greek family because we were short and everyone was like 7 feet tall over there. But my dad just sort of tried to talk to people. If somebody said something ridiculously inappropriate, like, did you have a donkey back in Greece? My dad, of course, had a car and could drive and had gone to university. He would say, there are some places in Greece that have donkeys, and but in the city we don't. And he would never, if somebody would say something that was ignorant or, just a little bit like they didn't know what was going on, he'd just sit down and talk to them. And so when I grew up, I just decided that that's what I was going to do. And wherever I've worked as a journalist, we always have to try to hear out people from every aspect if possible. I just try to listen. And that's when people have come to Greece and, various volunteers, what should I do? How can I help? I say, don't just help refugees. It's your priority, of course. But if you come across somebody who says all sorts of crazy things about people who are refugees, you have to do what that priest and the mayor in Andravida Kilini, the Syrian guy, Nabil Marant, what they do, which is to sit down with people out of your bubble and talk to them. As unpleasant or as uncomfortable as that is, You got to do it. And it's like the easiest thing you can do as one citizen. We can talk about like concepts here, and they're also very important. You know, the big ideas are very important, but one-on-one, that's what you can do, and that's what you have to do. Not just here, but anywhere you go. But it's worked well for me. I mean, I still get upset when people say things that I think are horribly racist or horribly culturally insensitive, but I still talk to them.
We have 2 minutes before we break for lunch. 1 minute, actually. So let's just get the question. We'll go quickly and probably take it up after lunch.
Sure. Hello, my name is Kristen Chang, and I'm a first year here at Wellesley. I want to thank you first, and I want to say that this is such a privilege to speak directly to you. Secondly, we've spoken extensively on national governments and international governments and what we could do and what we should do. But it's no secret that we suffer from a sort of democratic deficit and that most of us don't get a seat at that table. And Secretary Albright, seeing as though you have had a seat at that table, I would like to know what you feel is the most efficient way that we can turn this discussion from food for thought to fuel for action, and what you think we should do as private citizens to most efficiently end the refugee crisis. Thank you.
Well, I do think that we're going to really deal with that later in terms of a call to action, because I've been taking notes here in terms of how I would fit things into the short, medium, and long, and the personal stories and the various parts that have to happen in terms of personal context. But then I do think that we need to take some political action. This is a democracy. And I do think we're showing some resilience in it with the courts and what is happening with some people in Congress. But I do think that I hope that as we work our way through the day, that we actually will have some more specific things to suggest to a group of people that are smart and dedicated and want to do something. So I reserve kind of my full answer, but I do think that there are a variety of ways that we can make a difference as individuals and this community, and then in the larger context.
Thank you very much. Have a nice lunch. Bring your questions back. Thank you.